Um, okay. Welcome everybody. I appreciate everyone joining us today. We have a large crowd listening to us, and also I want to welcome the C-SPAN TV is broadcasting this as well, so we want to welcome their viewers as well. So the purpose of today's webinar is that we're going to discuss a report that GINSA's Commander Center just issued today called No Daylight, U.S. Strategy if Israel Attacks Iran. We decided to write this report because we think the chances of an Israeli military campaign against Iranian nuclear facilities has been rising, and it's important for the White House and Pentagon, the State Department, other parts of the U.S. government, as well as the U.S. Congress, to consider what the U.S. should do if Israel initiates a military campaign against Iran's nuclear facilities. Certainly, the Biden administration seems very attentive to this issue, this possibility. General Kurilla, the commander of our Mideast forces, our Central Command, CENTCOM, has been to Israel many times. Of course, Israel is now part of CENTCOM for the last couple of years. It's something that GINSA had recommended about 5 years ago, and we think it's great. But he seems to be going there extra amount of time. The chairman of Joint Chiefs Milley has been in Israel. Austin, our Secretary of Defense. The Israeli are getting a lot of attention from our military folks, and it's clear because the administration is very nervous about what if Israel does strike Iran. We have two members of our Iran task force that issued this report with us today. I will introduce them briefly, but then I'm going to give a brief summary of the report, and then I'll go to ask each of them questions. And of course, we welcome many questions from the audience. Please send them in. First, I want to introduce General Chuck Wald. He's a co-chair for many years of our Iran policy project. General Wald is the former deputy commander of the United States European Command, who is responsible for developing the air campaign Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. He also served as the director of strategic planning and policy at the U.S. Air Force headquarters, chief of U.S. Air Force Combat Terrorism Center. I could go on and on, but he was an Air Force pilot for 35 years, and he's also a distinguished fellow at GINSA. Our other speaker today is Elliot Abrams. He's also a member of our Iran Task Force project. Elliot is a senior fellow for Middle East Studies at the Council of Foreign Relations here in Washington, D.C. He served as Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor in the administration of President George W. Bush, where he supervised the U.S. policy in the Middle East for the White House. And he also has been in the Trump administration. He served as special representative for Iran and for Venezuela. Let me just highlight a few key points of our report before I go to you, Chuck and Elliot, for questions. I think probably a lot of our listeners know where the Iranian nuclear program is. In recent months, they've reached 84% nuclear enrichment. They're on the verge of becoming a nuclear threshold state. There's no evidence, at least it doesn't seem that the Iranians fear a U.S. military strike to prevent a nuclear Iran. And I think if Israel does take military action, it would really represent a failure over 3 decades of U.S. policy. Every president of the United States, since at least Bush 43, has said repeatedly that the United States will act to prevent a nuclear Iran, but it seems like we're getting very close to that very eventuality. Also, obviously, there's been a lot of focus with this new Israeli government on his views of, let's say, settlements, or obviously, as we see today, with judicial reform. But I think was probably escaped a lot of people's notice, is that this is probably the most hawkish Israeli security cabinet Israel has had when it comes to Iran. Some might remember when a lot of people thought Israel might attack Iran nuclear facilities. about a decade ago, a little over a decade ago, that there were folks in the security cabinet that opposed it. Israel does not, the prime minister is not a commander in chief like the US president. For major operations, he needs support of security cabinet. And this particular security cabinet seems especially hawkish on Iran. So there seems to be rising. There's a growing Iranian nuclear program on the verge of becoming a threshold state, a nuclear threshold state. Doesn't seem to be a credible U.S. military option, and the Israelis seem very focused on this, and certainly politically seem more cohesive. The government is more cohesive and coherent, probably than any other Israeli government is on being tough and willing to prevent nuclear Iran. Now, let me just highlight a few key points. So that's why I think where we are today. And then I think that if Israel, let me just, the report lays out, it focuses more about what the United States should do the day of and the day after Israeli military campaign. But it also addresses a few things which should be done before. And I think we've learned from the Ukraine issue that it's important to prepare for these things and not wait, because everything is much tougher once hostilities begin. But I think the report recommends for the day before consistent U.S. statements supporting Israel's freedom of action, making clear the U.S. is proactively giving Israel the tools it needs to maximize the effectiveness of its military action, including air refueling tankers, KC-46As, precision-guided munitions, more F-35s, more missile and air defenses, so on. Issues that our Iran task force has been recommending for a number of years. Secondly, and I'm just focused on some of the key highlights. On the day of, the report recommends that our top priority should be making clear that Israel's action is consistent with enduring U.S. policy, and that the U.S. fully supports Israel's self-defense needs and its security, that there should be no daylight between the United States and Israel. It could be that certainly with this administration, they might not want an Israeli strike, but that once Israel did strike, again, assuming that Israel will, we're not predicting that Israel will, but we're saying if Israel will, that really the two countries' interests merge or converge, which is that focus on success of an Israeli strike and focus on de-escalation. And that means specifically the U.S. should warn Iran beyond undue retaliation against Israel, and also warn Iran's proxy against getting involved and raining down all the 100,000 plus rockets and missiles that it has in its arsenal facing Israel. Also, on the day after, the task force recommends immediate and comprehensive resupply for Israel, prioritizing air and missile defense interceptors, precision-guided munitions, ammunitions, and spare parts. There also should be some military deployments by the United States to the region. And finally, I'll just add another recommendation of the group is a plan with Israel. The United States should plan with Israel for offering Iran a diplomatic off-ramp and figure out a better solution to Iran's nuclear program instead of allowing Iran to return to the nuclear threshold. I left out other recommendations. I just wanted to highlight one or two from the day before, the day of, the day after. All right, let me turn to you, Elliot. First, I wanted to ask you how you see before we get into what the U.S. should do, how do you see the reason why we're talking about an Israeli strike is because the assumption seems to be that the U.S. will not do it if it comes to that. I want to know if you could address that issue, how you look at the U.S. deterrence against Iran right now.
Well, you mentioned General Kurilla, the CENTCOM commander, and he said, I have the line right here, he said in March, I know right now when I look at Iran, I believe they are undeterred. So I think that's where we start and where the Israelis start. They don't seem to be deterred. If you look at the way they're continuing to build their nuclear program, They seem to think we can but won't, and they seem to think the Israelis don't have the capacity. And that's very dangerous, obviously, because that's precisely the kind of situation that can lead to a war. And one of the purposes of this report is to talk through deterrence. What does it mean in this situation? One of the things we say in the report, and you said it just now, 4 or 5 presidents in a row have said this will not happen. We will not permit it to happen. President Biden has said it. What he said was not going to get a nuclear weapon on my watch, which, you know, has another 1.5 years to go or 5.5 years to go, which is a long time. So the question then becomes, well, how do we do that? Assuming that the president is serious and knowing that the credibility of the United States, president after president after president, is on the line here, how do we, first of all, deter Iran from moving those final steps that could lead to some kind of military engagement? And then secondly, if we get to that point, we should not make the assumption that, you know, the book is all written. We know exactly what happens on day 1 and day 2 and day 5. We don't. No one does. And the level of violence can be very high or significantly lower, which is obviously what we want. And the length of any conflict can also be longer or shorter. And the lower, the shorter, the better. The only way to do that is to think it through now, which is what we're trying to do in the report. I would say right now, just to get directly to your question, I don't see that the administration, the Biden administration, really has an Iran policy. They had one. Go back to the JCPOA. But we're 2.5 years in. There's no evidence we're going to get there, that Iran wants to get there. Okay, now what? Well, you know, we've been sitting around for 1.5 years. It's been pretty clear the return to the JCPOA is not going to happen. So what is the policy then? How do you stop Iran from moving toward a nuclear weapon? I don't think the administration has ever actually answered that question. What's plan B?
Yeah, fun because some critics of the Trump administration said the same thing to that administration. What is your plan B after withdrawal? And my recollection was maybe it was 1 year ago or 2 years ago. I can't remember. Senator Menendez was interviewing, I think then Special Envoy Rob Malley there, and he says, "What's our plan B?" And seems like that question hasn't really been answered since.
You know, I would say in defense of the Trump administration, we had a plan B. If plan A was the JCPOA, the plan B was greater and greater and greater economic and political pressure on Iran. That was not a 4-year policy. You know, we only did that for about 1.5 years at the end. The theory was that if Trump had been reelected, you could say to the Iranians, okay, the pressure is going to increase more. Remember, at the end of the Trump administration, their national reserves that they could reach that were not frozen were down to $4 billion, which was really nothing for a country of 70, 80 million. We thought that if we could say there's going to be 4 more years of this, or let's negotiate a real solution to this, a real turn away from an Iranian nuclear weapons program. I would say, you know, would it have worked? We will never know whether it would have worked. But we did, you know, the successor administration then changed the policy and said, let's go back, or let's try to go back to the JCPOA.
Yeah. There's a lot to unpack what you said. I want to turn first to Chuck Wald. I'm going to come back to you, obviously. Chuck, how do you see, I mean, you spent 35 years, if I'm not mistaken. I forgot to mention you were air commander at CENTCOM also, and you know the region extremely well. I know you've been there many times, including sometimes with JINSA. How do you see a connection, first of all, to U.S. response or lack of response to conventional provocations? For example, JINSA did research earlier this year saying that, I can't remember, it came out a few months ago, there's some like 80 attacks by Iran and its proxies against U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria during the Biden administration. And I think we've retaliated now 4 times that we know. And how do you see, now the Wall Street Journal then subsequently wrote an article about this as well, but do you see, how do you see that? Do you see that as a signal to the Iranians on what we might or might not do about on the nuclear side?
Yeah, first of all, I'd like to say I agree with the ambassador totally. And number two is military people don't make policy and aren't diplomats. So that's why we have people like the ambassador there that are so articulate. But it's very simple to me. The ambassador mentioned deterrence. Deterrence is two things: believability or capability, and the will to do it. I don't think Iran have any doubts that we have capability in conjunction with, say, a military response from Israel. But the will part is the problem, and I'll leave that to the ambassador to get that part figured out. But I think we have to do some things to show that there is a unwillingness or reluctance or an unacceptability to the Iranian activity. The Soleimani assassination, if you will, legal, was a huge signal. That was a big deal. It showed the gumption and the will of the United States not to put up with the things he was doing. But as you mentioned, Mike, 80 different attacks that can be attributed to the Iranians, and they've got what I have heard and read, 19 different organizations around Israel that are sympathetic to Iran or part of Iran, or they're the proxies of Iran. And this goes on and on. So what happens eventually is you don't have the credibility, the kind of the hammer to make the diplomacy that people like Ambassador Abramson or Abrams, excuse me, are so good at doing. So I think, again, I don't want to have a war. I don't think most military people really are of that ilk. They'd like to avoid it via deterrence. But there's some actions you have to take that are somewhat unpalatable for some people. So I see recently we've sent F-35s to the region. We've sent a naval military cruiser to the region. They sent F-16s today to the region. Matter of fact, one of them used to be in my command. And so they're beefing up the tactical level. I think the F-35 is not a strategic bomber, or as any of the other aircraft. They're more for the protection of the Straits of Hormuz. My belief is, again, you have to demonstrate a will to be ready to go if you have to. As you mentioned, almost a decade ago, Israel was ready to go, and there was some reluctance in the U.S. administration at that time to do much about it, but I think the word got out that, yes, we would probably be there. My feeling is, I would recommend to people like the ambassador, if you were doing the diplomatic intervention with the Iranians, to tell them we have a military plan. We intend to use it with everything we have, short of nuclear weapons themselves. I've said before, I think we should deploy bombers to the region as a show of force. I think we ought to fly those bombers in the region. I also think we need to have a stronger approach to the GCC countries so they can be contributing to the air defense of the region. That's another part that doesn't get talked about a lot. But I think the only thing the Iranians will listen to is strength and the fear that if something, if their action doesn't stop, and there has to be action taken to stop the development of a nuclear weapon, that the United States, if Israel goes in, we're going to be right there with them, and we're going to be there sustained with them. The other thing that doesn't get mentioned much, but is the ballistic missile testing and capability the Iranians have been building. And so they have the capability. I think many people don't doubt their will. So I think they've actually got, in a way, a better capability to I guess, assert their will than we do. But I think we have to be a lot stronger. It's difficult times right now in Israel. It's difficult times here. But Israel is our closest, most common ally, I think, in the world. And I think Iran needs to know we'd be there ready to go if we had to.
let me go back on that last point of Chuck's last point. Elliot, look, you raised a few things, and I want to follow up on those. But let me start with one on the last point that Chuck raised, which is that our report raises the idea that one of the most important things the United States could do if Israel strikes is to put out a statement and communicate that we stand with Israel and there's no daylight, hence the title of the report. And I guess, and we make the argument that the closer the more there is no daylight, the greater the chance of de-escalation. But if America shows daylight with Israel, no matter what our policy or the views of senior officials might have been the day before the attack, once such a campaign commences, if we do show daylight, could invite the Iranians to escalate, retaliate more greatly, and have a wider conflict in the region. I guess, I don't know if you could address that issue.
No, well, I think that's correct, because again, this book is not written. We do not know if this ever happened. What exactly does it look like? You know, if there's an Israeli attack on a couple of Iranian nuclear sites, does Iran respond by hitting an Israeli nuclear site? Does it respond by going for Israeli civilians, by trying to kill as many people as it can? Does it respond by going for military bases, air bases in Israel? Does it respond by trying to order Hezbollah to send everything it has down into Israel? Those are decisions that have to be made. I think all those decisions are affected by their understanding of where the United States is. The supreme leader's understanding, the Iranian military's, Nasrallah's in Hezbollah in Lebanon, they've got decisions to make. And if they think the United States and Israel are closely allied, and that the United States is going to step in, it will matter. Do they try to close the Strait of Hormuz, the Iranians? Do they attack Gulf Arab nations on the other side of the Gulf? Again, those are questions that I think they won't answer for themselves until they, can do a cost-benefit analysis. They need to have a view of what the United States would do. And if their view is, the Americans they don't want to do anything, they just want to stay as far out of this as they can, then it's open season. If their view is, the Americans have escalation dominance, let's be quite careful, then the size of the conflict is diminished, the length of the conflict is diminished, and the damage done to us and our interests, I think, is diminished.
Let me ask you a follow-up, Elliot, on that. When you say, a belabor may be an obvious question, but I think it's worth elaborating. Why do you think the Iranians, or what the U.S. says and communicates, is so important to the Iranians? Is it because the last thing they want is a war with us, or how do you see the Iranian calculation on all this exactly?
Well, first, they need to make a judgment about what we're going to do. And they'll base that partly on what we say publicly, like the president's statement, they're not going to get a nuclear weapon on my watch, important. Partly on what they hear privately. I mean, we have lots of ways of sending messages through all sorts of channels to the Iranians. And those may be even more important messages. And then they watch what we're doing. And here, just think about what the general just said about ways, for example, of stationing bombers in the region. All those that's a really important message to Iran. Now, why does it matter to them? Because they are aware of the strength of the United States. And we point out in the report, on several occasions in 2003, when the United States attacked Iraq, after the killing, what did Iran do? They froze their nuclear program. After the killing of Soleimani, what have they done to the United States? Not much. Not much. Why not? Because they understand the power relationship. So what we're really arguing here is it needs to be as clear as possible that the willpower does exist. And maybe that deters them. And again, if it doesn't deter them, it changes the nature of the conflict.
Chuck, let me ask one more question, Ellie, then I'll come back to Chuck. You were deputy national security advisor for the Middle East. If you try to put yourself, let's take the Biden administration, so President Biden is president right now, so if it happened under his watch, it's obvious the administration does not want Israel to strike. How quickly do you see that presidents and the bureaucracy could shift their policy quickly? They might, if this happened under Biden, they might be pretty upset that Israel is doing this because they clearly have communicated they don't want Israel to attack. On the other hand, they would have to shift their policy rather quickly, I guess, because then, as we say, their interests pretty much align with Israel. They want de-escalation. Do you think administrations could shift that fast, or,
Well, yeah, I think so. I mean, first of all, we've got plans, no doubt, for all of this. We have plans for everything. I once said on TV that, my God, we've got plans for invasion of Canada. I heard from the Canadian embassy the following day, what? But put Canada out of this. We certainly have plans for Iran, so we can do it. It depends on a very small number of people, I think. That is, if the president gives the order, that's our policy. If the president says, we're going to open the Strait of Hormuz, we're not going to let him do that. If the president says, tell the Iranians if they hit an American ship, they will regret it instantly. He can do all of that. So, it's a narrow group of people, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, National Security Advisor, President, who are going to make these decisions. And they have the ability to make them, I think, quite quickly.
But let me ask you a couple. If the U.S. military thought Israel was striking soon, Iran, you mentioned some of the deployments you just mentioned with the F-35s and some of these other destroyers and so on. What would you think they would want to do to get ready for such a thing? I mean, is it just what they've done already, or would you envision greater deployments on sea and air and so on? What would you?
Yeah, I think yes. It's a matter of right now it's kind of in the hands of the Iranians. They're kind of making the decisions, which is unfortunate. They're driving the train, but I think beefing up our military capability, not just with bombers but aircraft carriers in the region, it's a big signal. It has been. It's a traditional signal. I think again, I've said it before. The credibility part is huge. And what worries me is we keep going down this path of, kind of warning, but nothing happening. It was like the Global Hawk that was shot down by the Iranians a couple of years ago. And the United States was threatening to retaliate. And then they decided not to. And then the credibility part for us hurt big time because countries like the United Arab Emirates didn't know that we had decided not to attack until they heard it on the news. We have got to have a very, very strong public, without acting like we're warmongers, statement of will here and demonstrated will. So I think some of it sounds symbolic. In the late 80s, we flagged all the ships going through the Straits of Hormuz and protected them with military power. It's called earnest will. That worked. The Iranians tried a couple of things here and there, but they finally decided it probably wasn't worth it. I think there's a lot of belief in some parts that the Iranians have their nuclear capability hardened, deep, and buried. You don't have to necessarily destroy their nuclear capability, although I think that would be a good thing to do. You can destroy their military capacity to be viable. And there's a lot of military targets you could go after. The Iranians have an internal problem right now too, so they're kind of vulnerable. But I think it boils down to me is credibility without saber rattling, without big talk. I think visualization of some of this from the standpoint of I'd put 2 aircraft carriers in the Persian Gulf right now, immediately. I'd send bombers to the region immediately. I'd have people like the ambassador in the government make statements that we're there because the threat that Iran poses, and we're ready to do whatever we have to protect the country of Israel. And we'll do that from both a deterrence standpoint and, if we have to degrade the Iranian military's capacity to do that. And it sounds like big, tough talk, but there's a lot to it. And so I think there's a question right now, because of the kind of wishy-washy statements we've made, that the Iranians see an opening. I don't think they think right now the United States would be there immediately on day one, the no daylight issue. And I think that has to be turned around immediately.
I could just follow up on that. I think the general's point about credibility is critical, and I would extend it out of the Middle East. I mean, just imagine what happens to American credibility if the Iranians get a nuclear weapon, we do nothing, or the Israelis attack, we do nothing. What is the message to China? With respect to what would the Americans do? Xi Jinping must be asking himself, what would the Americans do if China decided to invade Taiwan? And if the answer in the Middle East persuades him that he's got no real risks, then the chances of conflict over Taiwan grow as well.
That's a great point.
Do you think on that follow-up, Elliot, your experience, do you think a lot of other countries, foes and friends alike across the world, look at how the United States treats Israel? That Chuck mentioned earlier, that we may have more in common or be closer with Israel than any other country. And I guess, we've heard the Arab leader say that, he would be shocked if Israel, basically, the United States didn't support Israel. So do you think other countries, you mentioned China, Russia, other countries, friends and foes, like they say, if the United States doesn't even support Israel, why would they support us, or why would they oppose us, depending on the country? Do you see that?
I think General and I agree on this. Absolutely right. And what we in NATO have done in Ukraine has certainly been a message to Putin, obviously, but to the Chinese as well. It has strengthened our alliances in Asia with Australia, Japan, Korea, because they see an alliance working and they see the United States participating in that. We have such a long and close relationship with Israel. There's such rhetoric about it on the part of president after president, that if that relationship proves to be one we're ready to deprecate or walk away from or abandon if conflict arises, then you're really undermining the value, I would argue, of every alliance and every formal or informal, every security relationship we've got around the world.
Let me ask on that, because I was in Israel last month, and it was interesting to me. One senior general, Israeli general, said to me, every day that Netanyahu is not invited to the White House is dangerous. And we just had the Israeli president, of course, just spoke to Congress last week, joint session of Congress, obviously big deal, met with Biden and so on. He's the president, which is more ceremonial for most things, not the prime minister. Do you agree with that? Does that send a signal to the Iranians that the prime minister of Israel still hasn't been invited to the White House? Well, the U.S. isn't going to back Israel when it comes to Iran. I mean, how do you see the Iranian calculations on things like this?
Well, my own view is it's a mistake not to invite the Israeli prime minister, whoever it is. And I don't want to overstate it. I think if you're looking at it from Iran, you see there's a tension here that didn't exist, a year ago. But they know that the Intel relationship and the mill-mill relationship has continued. They know what you said right at the start, that General Kurilla from CENTCOM has made, 10 visits to Israel by now.
I think he's getting an apartment in Tel Aviv. I heard that.
So,
I'm joking.
Yeah. I think the Iranians are aware of that the relationship has not fundamentally changed. They're aware President Biden has a long commitment to Israel. And I think they're aware of one other thing I think is worth mentioning. There's a tremendous political fight in Israel right now, bigger than they've ever really had before. But there's complete unity when it comes to Iran. And we've heard leader of the opposition, Lapid, say it. There's no daylight. There is no daylight between left and right in Israel when it comes to Iran. So I think the Iranians are realistic enough to know our relationship is still very, very strong.
Look, President Herzog, in his speech last week and his previous position in government, was head of the Labor Party, which now only has a few seats, but he made it clear on Iran in Congress about how important it was for Israel, and they will not allow Iran to go nuclear. Chuck, let me ask some. Do you find, put on your old hat, in the military, what would you see about what would be a vulnerability that you would want to protect? Would you be worried, like Elliot brought up, would the Iranians hit, let's say, Saudi energy facilities, for instance? Would they hit Apcake like they did before in 2019? Would they? What do you see what would you want to make? What vulnerability would you want to make up for? I guess the most, but also, what do you think the Iranians are most vulnerable at militarily as well, that the United States could, really threaten them?
Yeah, it's the issue about Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates is complex. The Ambassador Abrams brought this up a minute ago, but our credibility is really waning in the region, and those allies, I call those allies, and GCC countries, are hedging their bets a little bit. As you pointed out, I've been there a lot. You have over the years, recently over the last couple of years, Mohammed bin Zayed in the Emirates and Mohammed bin Salman in the kingdom have started hedging their bets and leaning toward Iran, mainly because of the fear that they might be a part of the attack. So I think overall, I think our Middle East policy, and I've said this before, I'm frustrated a little bit with the rhetoric that occurred when then Secretary Clinton said we're going to pivot to Asia. I think we should be looking at Asia. We're a global power. The problem with pivoting is, like in basketball, you turn your back on something, and that word was not lost in Arab countries. So I think we need to treat the world as it is. I've said this before, not how we'd like it to be, but how it actually is. So then we can make it kind of like we'd like it to be. But I do think the GCC countries they're kind of waffling a little bit. They're hedging their bets right now, which is not a good thing, because Iran, if they are unleashed, they have not shown any reason to be reasonable as far as what they attack. It's all strategic for them, which is, pretty powerful. From the standpoint of what we could do against them, I do think the GCC countries, we need to keep working on them to have more of a regional air defense capability, but there are plenty of targets in Iran that are military targets that we could take on that would degrade their capability significantly, and we should probably, through back channels, release some of that data to the Iranians. I mean, I'm not sure they're going to put a lot more air defense up than they already have, but I really worry right now we're going to waffle our way into something that's hard to recover from. And if it gets started from behind the power curve because we're not prepared, 4 or 5 days or a week or so is a big advantage for an adversary.
Let me ask Elliot, let me bring another player, is Congress. You mentioned Ukraine. It seems to me that Congress, Democrats and Republicans in Congress, have been among the leaders pushing for a tough U.S. position, supporting Ukraine against Russia. And at least from my vantage point, I'm curious how yours seems to have influenced the administration, which at times seems to have been slow walking at times, support for Ukraine, at least in very concrete military terms. What do you think Congress's role here with an Israeli campaign, what would their role be? Or should be?
Same sort of thing. I mean, the administration will want to know where's the public and where's the Congress. And displays of support, meaning resolutions, basically speeches, but also votes. suggesting that the United States will not allow daylight between us and Israel on these questions, and that we remain committed to preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. I think that's the critical phrase. It was, I think, First President Obama who said, actually, I do not have a policy of containment. He said, I have a policy of prevention. And we need Congress to support this notion that we have a policy of prevention. And as the president said, they won't get a nuclear weapon on our watch. And that, you know, that obviously requires an enormous amount of diplomatic activity and the pressure of sanctions, and it may require more. So what Congress can do is show, well, if it requires more, we're there. We're supportive.
Are there things that Congress could be doing now? For instance, not just voting to support, provide Israel with weapons that they want, that they haven't gotten yet, expedited, like KC-46 air refueling tankers, things like that. Should they be doing hearings to be discussing these kind of issues now? Just curious.
They ought to have hearings on this report.
Yes, right.
Seriously, to talk about what would happen if there were a conflict is not to urge a conflict. It's not to seek a conflict. It's actually to seek A, to deter one, and B, to reduce the size of the conflict. And you mentioned before something that is actually the final word in the report. If there ever were a conflict, there's got to be a way to end it. And that is worth talking about and thinking through too. How do you do that? What are the diplomatic mechanisms that the United States and others would use if there ever were an Israeli attack, whether it involved us or not? How do you bring the conflict to an end? And that's something that needs discussion now, not in the midst of a crisis.
All right, I'd like to conclude the conversation in a minute. Does Chuck, do you have anything you'd like to add? Anything we haven't
No,
raised?
I think the ambassador is very articulate on this. One of the things that struck me, he said, was again, is the linkage between Taiwan and Israel from the standpoint of deterrence and messaging. We as a country need to be seen as somebody that can be depended upon. Our word means something. We live up to what we say. I'd like to avoid conflict if we can, but we have to be credible from the standpoint of the consequences. And Iran is not a rational country. So I think there has to be statements made, diplomatic statements. I think there has to be actions taken, and I think we're getting short of time for that. But I agree with the ambassador 100%.
Yeah. Do you think, Elliot, I asked you about your concluding comments. I guess, do you think the administration seems so nervous about an Israeli strike? Because they certainly seem that way. It's actually interesting. I don't hear others talking about it as much in Washington. Maybe I'm not in those conversations, but the administration, as we talked about with Gorilla and Milley and everyone going Israel so much, the administration is very focused on this, it seems like. Do you think they're so worked up, focused on what if there is a military conflict they haven't thought through? What are the alternatives? If they allow a nuclear round, what does that mean to our credibility? If we don't support Israel, what does that mean for our, what happens to Taiwan and so on? How do you see the administration?
I think they're stuck. I mean, they had a policy. They've never abandoned it. They've never said, okay, that's it for the JCPOA. Now we move on to a new policy. They haven't done that. They haven't explained what that might be. They don't want to seem to be thinking about or favoring an Israeli strike. They don't want to be seen to be planning an American strike. Fine. But you need a policy. I mean, the president's committed, the country's committed, but we don't seem to be actually doing anything, neither militarily. There's a little bit. I shouldn't say we're not doing anything. There have been some steps that we've taken. There have been some military steps and exercises that suggest preparation. So there have been a few steps, but they're not described in the setting of a coherent policy. And, we're still kind of talking to the Iranians indirectly about maybe there could be. So I think what's missing here is a policy. It's a clear statement from the president or the secretary of state to the Congress, to the American people. Here's our Iran policy. Maybe not 25 words or less, but 125 words or less. Where are we?
Mike, and just one quick comment on that.
Yeah, please, Chuck.
There was a statement made by one of the military leaders in the CENTCOM that somebody asked the question, what would you do if Israel attacked Iran? And the answer was, we'd have to stop and think about it. That's the wrong answer. The answer ought to be, if that happens, we're with Israel. And it ought to be unequivocal.
We mentioned that quote. I appreciate your mentioning that, Chuck, because we cite that quote by the senior CENTCOM Air Force officer in the report. I guess one more thing, Elliot, on your last comment. Do you think, you said they're stuck, the administration, there's no clear policy, they haven't articulated beyond what you said earlier, which was, some sort of return to the JCPOA or some version of it, and they've never really come up with any other plan B. Do you think they see that to do the deployments that Chuck mentioned, to expedite delivery of weapons that Israel thinks it needs for a conflict with Iran, like these KC-46s or precision guided munitions or the like, whatever, that the administration thinks that's going to facilitate a military campaign as opposed to deter the Iranians? Is that how?
I do. I think that's the problem. That is that we're arguing in this report that those kind of steps are likely to deter Iran and make conflict less likely. I think the administration thinks they would kind of free up Israel, make it more likely that there would be an Israeli attack. I think, to be honest about it, you can't say there's zero chance of that. I mean, as Israel's capabilities grow, its cost-benefit analysis might change, but our cost-benefit analysis, I think, should be heavily weighted toward deterrence.
And I would add, I think if there was a Israeli military campaign, I think, I'm just going to repeat what I said at the beginning and the report says, which is that I think whatever the administration's view of the two countries' interests now, once a military campaign by Israel commences, there really is a convergence of interests. We should want that campaign to succeed, to prevent a nuclear Iran. We should give Israel the space and capability for that to succeed, and that we want a de-escalation. And again, I think if there's daylight, it will only embolden the Iranians to retaliate stronger. And on that last thing, I'll just add, Elliot, I'm just curious what you think. One thing that intrigued me, for years, I always thought Hezbollah, their role, their job from the Iranian standpoint, with all their 100,000 plus rockets and missiles, is to act as a deterrent against Israel. And that if Israel does do something, that their job is to retaliate. But if you're Hezbollah's leader, Nasrallah, what do you think his calculation might be if Israel strikes? Because I got to think he's going to get a phone call or whatever it is from the supreme leader of Iran. He says, okay, now do your job. And you know what's going to happen to you if you don't. On the other hand, he's going to get some communication, I imagine, from the IDF and saying, if you start unleashing a torrent of rockets and missiles at our population centers and strategic targets, well, why don't you say goodbye to your family and to the rest of southern Lebanon? And I wonder, how do you think he's going to react? Because I asked the senior Israelis about it, and I think the inclination is you got to assume that he is going to participate in the Iranian retaliation, but it's not 100%, and it's possible, perhaps, to deter him. But I think there's disagreements in Israel about that.
I think there are disagreements. It's a great and important question. If you think that, a month after an Israeli attack, there might be not much left of an Iranian nuclear program or of Hezbollah, then Iran is greatly weakened in the whole region. So
Yeah.
maybe they still want to hold Hezbollah in reserve, or maybe Hezbollah is thinking about Lebanon. I want to make one other comment. If the Iranians decide in response not to do a counterstrike against Israeli nuclear reactor, but rather to go for the biggest possible war, to try to kill the greatest number of Israelis, to do the greatest amount of damage, to the infrastructure, to send in Hezbollah, to kill as many people, including civilians, as possible. It's hard to believe the United States is not going to be involved in this anyway, because we're going to be watching on TV thousands and thousands and thousands of Israeli civilians die. And we're going to be watching an immense amount of damage to that friend of the United States. And I think that in Congress and in the United States, there'll be a desire to help, which is, again, why the report, because we should be thinking this through now.
Mike, can I just make one comment on that?
Yeah, please.
Hezbollah issue. It's kind of ironic to me that, and we rightfully say this, but when President Biden says a attack on 1 inch of NATO will bring on the United States response through Article 5 of the NATO agreement. I think we should say the same thing publicly about Hezbollah. That, an attack by Hezbollah will be retaliated by the United States with all due force, and say it in advance. It's implied, but first of all, I support the fact we're supporting Ukraine unequivocally. And I think the rhetoric's been right. I'd like to see a little more support. But I think we should make, even though they're not a NATO ally, and we don't have the same kind of treaty with Israel, I think we should make a public comment that an attack by Hezbollah will be responded to by the United States.
Okay. Well, look, I appreciate both of your comments. I appreciate the work of the task force to put this out. Again, to repeat what we said and what Elliot has repeated a couple times here, the point of the report is to help. We gave our views about the way we think a U.S. president and administration and Congress should be thinking about things. But I think most importantly right now is we think there should be a greater discussion in Washington among U.S. officials and senior folks in Congress about what would happen if Israel strikes Iran. And, so we should be prepared, since it's much better to be prepared before than be taken by surprise. And we all see what that's like. So again, I want to thank you, Elliot and Chuck Wald, for participating today. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. And please look on our website, jinsa.org. If you haven't received an email with our report, please look on our website, jinsa.org, to read it. It's a pretty short report. And just look out for future reports and op-eds and webinars that we'll be putting out on this subject and related matters. So thank you very much. And thanks again for joining today. Thanks, Elliot.